Your pattern layout will depend on your size pattern and the width of your fabric. Here, my fabric is not as wide as I need it to be, so I will fold one edge of the fabric to the width of my pattern. Then I will fold the excess fabric on the other edge to cut the belt. Check your PDF for the different options by which you can cut. Secure the pattern with weights or pins and cut. You can trace it for additional guidance. Don't forget to make your notches. They are our control points and are pretty important in helping us to match the pattern. Cut the selvage edge off of your fabric, mark and cut out your belt. This is how I like to cut my bias strips. I always use my leftovers to make them for future use. Fold your rectangle fabric strip diagonally at 45 degrees and cut on the folded edge. Then mark the width of your strip, ours is 1.5 inches, and cut. Another way to cut your bias strips is to use a cutting mat and a rotary cutter. I'm using chiffon fabric here, so for the ruffle pieces I just ripped two 18-inch long strips to have straight edges. They are as wide as my fabric piece. Here are our cut out pattern pieces. We have 5 bias strips, our front and back, 2 ruffle pieces, and a belt. Sew the shoulder seam using a French seam. Place front and back wrong sides together, matching your notches at the shoulders, and sew a 1/4 inch from the edge. Since I'm using chiffon, a pretty slippery fabric, a pin is a helpful instrument in holding it in place. Do a backstitch at the beginning and the end. Trim the seam allowance. Turn the fabric right sides together and press your seam. On the wrong side of the fabric, sew a 1/4 inch from the edge. Our seam allowance will be inside of our seam. Do the same to the other shoulder. Press your seam towards the back. Here it is pressed. It is much easier to sew. Sew the folded bias strip to the right side of your bodice. The folded edge of the strip should face away from the edge. The width of the seam is a 1/4 inch, and the edge is aligned with the machine foot. Fold your bias strip towards your seam allowance. Top stitch the bias strip very close to the seam, about 1 millimeter away. Don't do a back stitch when sewing a top stitch. Trim the seam allowance. Place your bodice wrong side up and fold your bias strip towards the wrong side. Pin it at the center of the sleeve. Sew close to the edge on the other side of the bias strip. Repeat for the other sleeve and press both. Now on to our neckline. Stay stitch the neckline to restore the shape. Take your ironed bias strip, fold it in half, and make sure it's longer than your neckline. Start from the center back and leave 1 inch of the bias strip unsewn. Sew a 1/4 inch from the edge. Lay the bias strip on the curve of the neckline and carefully sew little by little, adjusting as you go. Once again, don't stretch the bias strip, otherwise you won't have an even result at the end. Once you reach where you started, take the beginning of the bias and fold it back for now. Take the end of the bias strip, place it on the bodice following the curve, and fold it away on an angle to make a neat corner. Then take the beginning of the strip and place it over the corner, not fully lining up with the edge. Go over a couple of the previous stitches so you don't have to do a backstitch. Trim the excess. Fold the bias strip towards the seam allowance, covering it, and top stitch about 1 mm away from the seam. Trim seam allowances. Turn the bias strip towards the wrong side and pin at the shoulder seams, center front, and center back so that the strip will lay correctly and won't twist. Start at the shoulder seam, sewing close to the edge of the bias strip. Once you're done, you can take out your stay stitch and press. To hem our bodice, fold 1/8 of an inch in towards the wrong side, fold again, and sew. Repeat on the other side and press. Hem one edge of the ruffles and press. Here's our beautifully pressed hem. To gather our ruffles, change the length of your stitch to the maximum, -5 points, and add 1/4 of an inch from the edge, sew a seam without a backstitch. Place the second seam 1/4 inch from the first one. Find the center of your bodice and mark at the hem. Find the center of your ruffle and pin to match the bodice hem. Place the ruffle on top of your bodice, overlapping about 1/2 inch. It depends how wide you'd like this top ruffle to be. Pin at the beginning and at the end. The seam will go in the middle of these two gathered seams. Find the middle point between the pinned fabric and pin again. Distribute the fabric evenly. Take the bottom 2 threads and pull to gather your ruffle and space it out to make it equal the bottom of your dress. Do the same to the other side. With the regular seam, leave 1 inch from the edge unsewn and sew in the middle of your 2 gathered seams. Take out your gathered seam so that your work will be clean. Press your ruffle on the right and wrong sides. Do the same to your other side. At first, I had wanted to sew my side seams all in one piece, but then I decided to sew my bodice side seams and my ruffle side seams separately and then join them. Sew the side seams of your ruffle with the French seam. Pin together the side seams of the ruffle wrong sides together, sew, trim, turn to the wrong side, and sew again. Now I will sew together the side seams of the bodice. Place the wrong sides together and match the notches. Sew and trim. Turn to the wrong side and sew 1/4 inch from the edge. Then turn to the right side, trim any excess threads, and secure the ruffle at the sides. Hem the ruffle. I folded 1/2 inch and another 1/2 inch. I wanted a heavier hem this time, but you could fold it for 1/8 inch as well. To make the belt, fold your piece in half and start sewing from the middle to one side. When you start sewing from the middle out to the sides, you will avoid twisting your fabric. Leave an opening of about 2 inches and sew to the other side. Flip your belt inside out, press, and hand sew the hole. And our beautiful Mila dress is complete.